Chapter 4. As Diane Breckinridge pulled her car into the drive, she immediately noticed the faded American flag flying on the front of her house. She had to smile. Her father had arrived, no doubt about it. The smile slowly faded, however. While happy to see he had made the trip okay, she also felt guilty. Not only had she missed his arrival, but would be having to leave the very next morning. Her office had just received a call from a senior Senate member, one with whom she had desperately been trying to get a meeting. His office had extended an invitation to a Memorial Day gathering in his district, and 3 days of having the senator's ear was an opportunity she just couldn't pass up. She was a political Captain Ahab, and the capital had no shortage of white whales. She retrieved 4 bags of groceries from the back seat before making her way up the front walk. She was a small woman, with crow's feet at the corners of her eyes and shoulder-length brunette hair that she had tinted once a month so the gray wouldn't show. She wore large glasses perched atop her nose, which Scott always teased made her look like a librarian. "And what would you know about a library, baby boy?" she would always fire back. "You'd actually have to leave your room to see one." She juggled the groceries and somehow managed to unlock the door without dropping any. Once inside, she was surprised to find the living room quiet and empty, with no sign of the newest resident. After announcing her presence and getting no reply, she sat the groceries down in the kitchen and glanced down the hall. Walter's door was closed, and she guessed he was probably taking a much-needed nap after the long journey. Further down, Scott's door was also shut. No great surprise. She made her way through the obstacle course of moving boxes and lightly knocked on Walter's door. "Dad, are you in there?" When there was no answer, she slowly opened the door and stuck her head in. She found Walter sitting on the bed, eyes closed, with a hand on his forehead and looking sad. When he opened his eyes, she was startled to see they were red. And were those tears on his cheek? She quickly stepped in. Walter looked up as she entered and forced a smile. "Hello, sweetheart." She knelt beside him and touched his face. "Dad, are you okay? Why are you crying?" "I'm not crying," he said, quickly wiping his face. I was just rooting around in these old boxes. Darn things are covered in dust." He took her hand and patted it. "It's good to see you, Diane." She looked at him a moment, undecided if she believed him about the dust. If she knew anything about the man, it was that he always kept his problems to himself. Always had, probably always would. She decided not to press the matter, and instead kissed his forehead. "Well, I'm glad you made it okay. I'm sorry I wasn't here to greet you personally." "Nonsense," he objected. "You didn't know when I'd get here. You're a busy woman, rubbing elbows with all those important politicians." "Self-important politicians, maybe." She smiled. "By the way, I like your flag out front." "Thanks," Walter said, brightening a bit. "I found it in one of my old boxes. It only has 48 stars, though. Hawaii and Alaska are missing until I can get a new one." She laughed. "I won't tell anyone. Now, how about I cook you a nice welcome home dinner? Go wash your face and clean that dust off, okay?" "Yes, Mother," he said, and they both grinned. He stood up, and she hugged him tightly before he shuffled off toward the bathroom. Scott jumped when his headset was suddenly ripped off his head, very nearly taking his ears with him. He was back at his computer, playing the same gory video game in the dark, and had been so consumed in the action he hadn't noticed anyone come in. "Ow!" he said, looking up in surprise. Diane stood over him, looking quite irate. Though he hadn't seen it in a while, he knew that look well enough. "What the heck, Mom? My ears are attached, you know." She only glared down at him. "Why was your grandfather crying in his room?" Scott looked at her like he didn't know what she was talking about, which, truthfully, he didn't. I don't know. Maybe because he's nuts? He knew immediately that was the wrong thing to say, but it had just slipped out and there was no taking it back. She put her hands on her hips and cocked her head, looking every bit as though she wanted to box him upside the head. She may have been small, but could still be quite intimidating when she wanted to be, like an angry chihuahua. "Excuse me?" she asked, one eyebrow raised. Scott sighed and tried to explain. "He flipped out a while ago. Came barging in here asking about flags. Then he yanked open the blinds and started yelling at me to turn my computer off. What the heck is wrong with him anyway?" Diane wasn't sure how much of this was fact and how much was dramatic embellishment. Still, something had obviously happened, so she took a seat on the bed. "Walk me through it," she said, one of her favorite sayings. He did, and although the story was predominantly one-sided, she got the gist. When he was finished, she drew a deep breath, trying to think about how best to proceed. Choosing her words carefully, she said, "Scott, Walter is an old man. He's a weird old man." She bit her tongue and let the comment slide, barely. She looked at him sharply, a subtle warning that he was skating onto thin ice with that one. "He's my father, Scott. Your grandfather." "Technically, he's your grandfather and my great-grandfather." She frowned at the correction, but continued. "Whatever, he's still family. Yes, he is elderly, and he's going to have some ways different than what you're used to. And he's going to have some special needs as well. But you're just going to have to learn to live with that, baby boy. I'm the one who pays the bills, so I'm the one who gets to decide who lives here, okay?" Scott grunted sourly. There it was. She had played the dreaded free rent card. The deal was that as long as he remained in school and was getting passing grades, she would cover the living expenses so he could focus on graduating. So far, his grades were stellar. Most of the time, he was actually bored because the topics were so basic. He felt he could probably have been teaching the courses himself if it weren't for that whole public speaking part. "Okay," she repeated, clearly expecting an acknowledgement. "Okay, boomer," he thought, though he dared not say it out loud. Instead, he only nodded. "All right," she said. "I'm going to go cook dinner, and we're all eating at the table." Scott looked at her as though the very idea was a foreign concept. She saw his puzzled look and explained. "It's his first night, so we're going to spend it as a family." She paused, looking a bit guilty. "And I have to go out of town tomorrow." Scott groaned. It wasn't unusual for Diane to jet off at the drop of a hat to go and schmooze some congressperson with a last-minute opening in their schedule. Normally, he would have enjoyed having the house to himself, but this time he would be trapped with an intruder. He thought once about asking what he was supposed to do if the old man croaked, but then thought the better of it. He had already pushed her buttons enough for one day. Diane stood and handed him back his headset, then kissed the top of his head. Only after she left the room and shut the door did Scott growl his extreme displeasure. He snapped the headset back on, more than ready to return to his game and take out his frustrations on whoever had the misfortune of crossing Black Cat's warpath. He was happier in the digital world, where most of his problems could be resolved with belts of bullets and packs of high explosives. Dinner was quiet. Very quiet. Walter and Scott had both pecked at their plates of spaghetti as Diane unsuccessfully attempted to initiate some form of conversation between sips of wine. "How was the drive, Dad?" "Fine." A nod of her head, a sip of Moscato. "How are finals going, Scott?" "Good." Another nod, another sip, followed by one more because she desperately needed it. The only thing that even sparked any reaction was when she asked Walter if he had any plans to sightsee now that he was there. He looked up from his plate and nodded thoughtfully. "I was hoping to see the World War II Memorial," he said, "and Arlington Cemetery." Scott only grunted, wondering what could possibly be so interesting about seeing a bunch of tombstones. Diane, on the other hand, seized upon the opportunity with enthusiasm. "Absolutely! You and Scott can hop the bus. He'd be happy to show you around." Scott nearly choked on his food and shot her a look that said he most certainly would not. Walter only grunted and looked back at his plate of noodles. He hadn't seen Scott's reaction, but he didn't need to. He already knew he was being enough of a burden. "Scott's busy with school, Diane," he said. "Finals can be stressful." "Are you kidding?" she countered. "Once he's done, he'll be free all summer." Scott suddenly looked panicked. It was bad enough having to live with the crazy old man, but now he was also expected to babysit him and play tour guide? "Why not just call an Uber?" Scott suggested. "Or I can build you a desktop and you can see everything you want online. You won't even have to get out in the heat." Diane scoffed and took another sip of Moscato. "It's not the same thing, Scott." Walter grinned at the notion and shook his head. "It's a new generation, Diane." Scott, taking the comment as an insult, became defensive. "Yeah, it's called progress." "Progress," Walter scoffed. "Sometimes I think your generation is so busy, focused on tiny little screens, that they've forgotten how to look around at the world." "My generation connected the world, Walter. Yours nearly destroyed it." "Scott!" Diane said, shocked at the rude statement. It also peeved Walter, though he did his best to keep his cool. "Your generation couldn't do what mine had to, Scott." "My generation wouldn't have to. We know better." Walter scowled. "Your generation doesn't even know what bathroom to use." Scott pushed his plate away, stood, and abruptly left the room. Walter and Diane sat quietly, with the ticking of the kitchen clock the only sound to break the uneasy silence. She made no pretense about sipping her wine anymore, and instead finished the glass off in one large swallow. Walter folded his hands over his mouth and sighed. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said, though unsure exactly which part she was apologizing for. Walter forced a smile. "It's okay. I don't think he's quite warmed up to the thought of me being here yet. I can't say I blame him." "Maybe I should cancel my trip tomorrow," she said, concerned. "No," Walter said. "He'll come around. It's all just new to him. He's a good boy, smart." "A little too smart," she agreed, then reached for the wine bottle and refilled her glass. She offered some to Walter, but his was still half full, and he politely shook his head. "No, thank you," he said. "I'm about to call it a night." He stood and started to reach for his and Scott's plates, but she quickly waved him away. "Nope, I've got it. It's your first night, and I'm sure you're exhausted from the trip." He was, actually, and nodded his thanks. "I am at that." "Then you go on to bed. Get some rest." "I will in a bit," he said. He looked hesitant, then added, I have to go make a peace offering first." Diane sighed, but nodded in understanding. As Walter disappeared down the hall, she silently bid him good luck. Then she took another gulp of wine. Scott's shoulders slumped when he heard the knock at his bedroom door. He knew it could only be Walter. All he wanted was to be left alone to play on his computer, but here the old man was coming around for yet another bout. He thought once about not answering, pretending he didn't hear or was already asleep in bed. He was still plenty peeved about the disparaging comments Walter had made about him and his generation. The knock came again, and Scott sighed heavily. Wishing to avoid any unpleasant repeats of Walter's earlier outburst, Scott dropped his video game to the main menu, before yelling toward the door. "Entree!" It slowly opened, and Walter cautiously stuck his head in. "Hey, buddy." "Hello, Walter," Scott said, his tone dry and far from friendly. Walter winced inwardly. When Scott was a kid, he had called him Pop-Pop, but now it was simply Walter. He knew it would be a long, hard road before Scott would come around to using any new term of endearment. But that's why he was there now, to try and make peace. "Look, Scott," he said uncomfortably. "I'm sorry we had a little spat earlier today, and again at the dinner table." "Forget it, Walter." "No," Walter said. "We're getting off on the wrong foot here, and I'd like to try and fix that." "We aren't as lame as you think we are, you know," Scott said. Walter only nodded, though he still had to disagree. Any generation that required safe zones or comfort animals, or felt the need to abolish anything they deemed offensive, there was no way they could have lived through what his generation had. Still, he knew sharing this thought would only provoke further conflict, so he kept it to himself. "Would you mind coming to my room for a minute?" Walter asked. His room, Scott thought bitterly. Now that was a laugh. He had zero desire to go anywhere with Walter, but since it was likely the fastest way to get rid of the old fart, he reluctantly followed him down the hall. His room looked pretty bleak, filled only with moving boxes, a bed, a stuffed chair, and a nightstand, the top of which was filled with more prescription bottles than Scott could count. Looking at the assortment of medication, he mused that the old man could practically open his own pharmacy. Walter sat down on the creaky bed and thought for a moment before speaking. The words didn't come easily. "I'd like to apologize for my little eruption this afternoon." Scott only shrugged, then lied. "No biggie." "No," Walter said. "It is a biggie. I know I startled you, and I'd like you to know why. Would you mind picking that up, please?" He pointed to his box of war memorabilia sitting on the floor. "Be careful. It's very heavy. I nearly killed myself with it earlier." At least we'd get that out of the way, Scott thought. Still, he did as he was asked. He picked up the box, which looked ancient and was covered in dust. The old man wasn't kidding. It was heavy. He had to wonder if Walter hadn't absent-mindedly tossed in a cinder block or two by mistake. "Okay, now what?" Scott asked. "Take it. It's yours. I want you to have it." Scott looked surprised, then puzzled. "What is it?" "My old war things." Scott was suddenly intrigued, wondering what kind of heavy war things could be inside. Guns? Bullets? Maybe a hand grenade or two? "Really?" he asked. "You sure?" Walter only nodded, misty-eyed. "It's mostly just personal items. Photos, letters, things like that." Scott was disappointed, and his interest in the box quickly waned. No explosives. Bummer. He turned to set the box back down. He already had enough boxes of junk crowding his room, and the last thing he needed was another one to clutter things up even more. "No, I can't take this," he said. "These are your things. You better hang on to them." "No," Walter pressed. "I want you to have them. But under one condition." Wonderful, Scott thought. Not only was he being forced to take something he didn't even want, but it came with a condition. Walter looked sad as he continued. "Some things in there belong to young men who, well, didn't make it home." He paused as a pang shot through him. "They were my men, my friends. One was even my best friend. When you go through all that stuff, I want you to think of them. They were boys your age, boys who never got to see their families again. Scott stood quietly holding the box, unsure what to say. The mood had suddenly turned gloomy and uncomfortable, with Walter looking as though he were on the verge of tears. "Okay," Scott nodded, more than ready to get out of there. Then, out of a weird sense of obligation, he added a quick thanks before quickly slipping out the door and back to his room. As it turned out, Walter's box actually did have some pretty interesting things inside. There were some old dog-eared Army field manuals. If you are captured, these are your rights, and what is expected of a U.S. soldier in foreign lands. Assorted coins from France, Belgium, Italy, and Germany, dress uniform brass, countless yellowed letters both to and from home, and a few bent postcards from England. There were also various frayed military ribbons and, surprisingly, some medals in small velvet-lined boxes. He recognized one as being the Silver Star and another as the Purple Heart, and couldn't help but wonder what stories lay behind those. He also found a tarnished Zippo lighter that was 72 years overdue for a refill, and about 100 faded black and white photographs of young men in an Army uniform. As Scott examined the pictures, he noticed one particular young man throughout most of them, and was shocked when he realized it was Walter. He had been about Scott's age when the photos were taken, a notion he found truly bizarre. He had never considered that the old man had once been young. Even more shocking was the patch on his uniform, which Scott recognized from his games as being the emblem for the 82nd Airborne. Holy crap, he thought, completely shocked. Walter had been a paratrooper? That was badass! Not that he would ever admit that, of course. The biggest surprise in Walter's box, however, laid at the very bottom. It was a wooden container addressed to Walter, postmarked September of 1944, and with a return address from John Maxwell of Brooklyn, New York. Inside, Scott was surprised to find yet another box, and began to wonder if this was some kind of joke, that he would be opening smaller and smaller boxes like a set of Russian Matryoshka dolls. This one, however, was from somebody named Curtis Maxwell, with a military postmark dated August of 1944. Oddly, the box was screwed shut and did not appear to have ever been opened. It took him a few moments to piece together that Curtis Maxwell had apparently mailed this box to John Maxwell, who in turn mailed it to Walter, unopened. He was tempted to go ask Walter what the story was, or at least who the people were, but quickly dismissed the notion. That was probably what the old man wanted him to do, and he wasn't about to fall for the scheme. It was then he noticed the letter, yellowed with age, neatly folded in half and tucked down beside the unopened box. He took it out and unfolded it gingerly, half afraid it would crumble apart in his hands. It was handwritten and dated August 19th, 1944. Lieutenant Thomas, thank you for your letter and your kind words about our son. I know it's your duty to write the family of every man lost under your command, but Curtis spoke of you often, and I know of your personal friendship with him. I want you to know that he both liked and respected you, and to know that you, his friend, was there with him during his final moments gives us some small comfort. We are, however, returning his personal items to you. While it was thoughtful of you to send them to us, please know that they only serve as a painful reminder of our terrible loss. Our son is gone, taken by this horrible war, and it is our decision to return to you anything having to do with it. Please understand, we mean no disrespect, and do not want to appear ungrateful. We simply choose to remember Curtis, not as another casualty of war, but instead as the kind and happy boy we always knew. You knew him as a soldier, but we knew him as a son. With deepest regards, John Maxwell. Scott read the letter again and couldn't help but feel a lump form in his throat. He had no idea who Curtis was, but he had obviously been one of Walter's buddies. Whoever he was, it was suddenly painfully clear that after he had been killed, his family hadn't wanted his war stuff lying around to remind them of it. They had mailed it back to Walter, who only packed it away unopened. Now it was Scott, who, some 7 decades later, was left with making the decision as what to do with it. Suddenly, he was a part of the chain. "Curse you, Walter," he thought. "Your evil plot will not work on me." He took out the small box and set it beside him on the bed, where it indented the mattress. Whatever was inside was apparently what had made the larger boxes so heavy. He stared at it a long time, wondering what could possibly be in there. His mind swam with all the possibilities, everything from captured weapons to stolen Nazi treasure. Finally, when he could stand it no more, he decided to open it. After all, it was his now, right? Walter had given it to him, hadn't he? Why shouldn't he open it? The old man had instructed him to think of the men the stuff used to belong to, so in a way, opening it would just be like paying his respects to Curtis. Scott reached over to his desk and took out a screwdriver. It took some effort to loosen the screws, which screamed in protest with each turn, having been so firmly settled in place for 72 years. Once he had them all removed, he lifted the lid and was met with the musty smell of all the aged items inside. Most were similar to what he had found in Walter's box. Medals, letters, photographs. He had to snicker when he found a package of vintage trading cards with "Ooh la la" printed on the cover. Inside were grainy black and white photos of nearly naked women in an assortment of risque poses, each with an arm or leg strategically placed to conceal any of the more interesting parts. "Draw me like one of your French girls, Jack," he mused. Scott was also surprised to find there actually was a weapon in the box. It was a large dagger in a cracked leather sheath, and, taking it out, he was shocked to discover a white swastika etched on the black handle. The sight of the emblem both stunned and enthralled him. World War II was something he was only familiar with through his video games, and maybe some of the old black and white movies his mother loved to watch so much. But he had never actually gotten into exploring the actual history of it. Now, holding this knife, knowing it was the genuine article, and seeing the symbol that would forever be associated with pure evil, somehow made the war more real. Even more intriguing were the questions it brought. Where had it come from? What Nazi had carried it? Had it been only for decoration? Or had it actually been put to use? How had Curtis gotten it? Scott briefly considered going back and asking Walter what he knew about it, but his pride just wouldn't allow it. To do so would mean having to admit Walter's plan had worked. Worse, he would undoubtedly have to endure a needless lecture about how war wasn't a game. "You think, Walter?" Scott thought bitterly. War was the reason he'd grown up without a father, after all. Had the old man never stopped to consider that? His eyes drifted to his computer desk, and, without even thinking about it, he reached over to slide the drawer open. There, amidst the clutter of paper clips and mechanical pencils, was a large silver coin. He picked it up and slowly began to turn it over in his fingers. It was a Navy SEAL challenge coin, and showed the image of an eagle clutching an anchor, a flintlock pistol, and a trident in its talons. On the reverse was a 3-mast ship sailing on the ocean, encircled by the words, "United States of America, Department of the Navy." He couldn't remember who had given it to him, only that it had been some time during his childhood. It had belonged to his father, they said. The trinket had never really meant anything to him, other than thinking the eagle holding the weapons was kind of cool. Now, looking at it, the boxes and the German knife, he found himself wondering how much he could get for all this stuff on eBay. He placed the items aside and resumed rooting around in the box. His fingers came across something lying at the bottom. It was round, hard, and wrapped in a cloth. Lifting it out, he was shocked at the weight. It was roughly the size and shape of a frisbee, but was made of metal. This was obviously the item that was making the box so heavy, and as he slowly peeled the cloth away, he was utterly flabbergasted by what he saw beneath. It was gold. He removed the object from its wrappings and found it was a loop about 12 inches in diameter. It swiveled on a square base, from which dangled several cloth-wrapped wires, old-school stuff, long before the days they were coated in plastic. He looked the loop over, wondering what the heck it was for. His first thought was that it might be a loop antenna of some sorts, but he had never heard of one being made of gold before. Examining it more closely, he was amazed to find patterns engraved on the surface. He took a magnifying glass from off his desk for a better look, and was shocked to find they weren't engravings at all. They were actually inlaid traces, completely independent of each other and resembling the conductive tracks found in circuit boards. But that couldn't be right, because that kind of technology didn't come out until, well, he wasn't really sure. They had briefly covered the history of electronics in class, but he hadn't paid much attention to the dates. He leaned over to his computer and quickly typed in a search. The beauty of the internet was that anything you ever wanted to know was only a few keystrokes away. He had his answer in seconds, and was surprised to learn that the precursor to modern circuit boards had actually been developed in 1943 by an Austrian named Paul Eisler. The revelation hit him like a sledgehammer. If circuitry technology was developed in 1943, and this, whatever it was mailed in 1944, he could possibly be in possession of one of the very first circuit boards ever developed. Holy crap! This gold loop, hidden away for over 70 years, just might be one of the precursors to every electronic component in existence. Questions began to flood his brain like mental tidal waves. What the heck was this thing, and where had it come from? Who made it, and how had Curtis wound up with it? Most importantly, what had it been made to do? He again thought about going back to Walter's room to ask him about it, but again vetoed the idea. Walter was surely asleep by now, and even if he weren't, there was sure to be the obligatory interaction and lecture. No thanks. Instead, Scott reached back in the desk drawer and took out a digital multimeter. It had two thin probes that looked like short knitting needles, one red for positive and one black for negative. He touched the tips to the assorted wires on the base and, as expected, got no results. The thing had likely not had any external power for a very long time, and no internal battery could have been expected to last so long. Digging deep into another drawer, he produced a 6-volt lantern battery and sat it beside the loop. He then began to touch the dangling wires from the base to the terminals, trying to figure out which combination would produce a closed circuit. Only briefly did it occur to him that he might unwittingly be activating some type of explosive device, one that would unexpectedly blast him through the roof. He dismissed the notion, thinking that such things were rarely made of gold, were almost never unlabeled, and certainly weren't usually found hiding at the bottom of an old man's war trunk. Hopefully, anyway. Fortunately, the only thing that exploded were the numbers on the multimeter. When Scott finally found the correct connection, they rocketed from 0 until they fluctuated in the thousands. He was quite shocked by the result. The voltage was being returned at such an exponential rate that he could only conclude that the thing must be acting as a capacitor by storing energy. No huge surprise there. The thing was made of gold, after all. Gold was the third best conductor of electricity known to man, with silver being the first and copper being the second. The latter two were prone to tarnishing, however, which was why gold was often the first choice for use in anything of importance: satellites, computers, cell phones, even airbags in cars. All utilized gold because of its dependability and resistance to corrosion. To Scott, that meant this thing must have been pretty important to someone. They put a lot of time, effort, and money into creating it, especially considering it was technology that hadn't even been invented yet. Scott tried a few more combinations with the probes, each one making his multimeter go absolutely berserk. Now extremely curious, he dug out another tool from his desk, a portable digital oscilloscope. He attached it to the dangling wires and was both perplexed and amazed when the most puzzling waveforms appeared on the screen. What the heck was this thing? He intended to find out. He went to his mini-fridge and grabbed a bottle of cappuccino. Then he grabbed his MP3 player, a tiny silver box that, although small, held his entire 6-gig music collection. He untangled the earbuds, placed them in his ears, and hit shuffle. He spent the next few hours at his computer, listening to music and running all sorts of diagnostics on the gold loop. In between tests, he would slug down cappuccino and swat at an annoying fly that also seemed determined to get a caffeine fix. He eventually wound up attaching the wires from the gold loop to a ribbon cable, which he soldered directly into an empty expansion slot on his motherboard. After surfing the web and copying mathematical formulas that would have given even Stephen Hawking a headache, he managed to write some code that would run a series of recursive and sub-recursive algorithms. It was a long shot, to say the least, the equivalent of tossing out a few thousand random letters and seeing what words would be formed after they hit the ground. The majority would be gibberish, but given enough attempts, there would occasionally be enough words to form a complete sentence. Dogs run, rocks explode, cows poop. It was labor-intensive, to be sure, and had Scott attempted this experiment manually, it would have taken him several lifetimes before he would stumble upon the correct combination. However, since his computer could run thousands of variations per second, it would instead just be a matter of days, hours, or minutes. Scott leaned back in his chair and, like Tom Sawyer smugly watching others whitewash the fence for him, happily observed as the screen flashed a series of numbers, changing faster than his eyes could follow. The computer was trying to pick a digital lock by using an infinite number of combinations, and it was almost hypnotic. It wasn't long before his eyes grew too heavy to stay open, and he fell fast asleep. At exactly 3:07 a.m., after running over 1 trillion assorted combinations, the computer finally landed on the correct sequence. The loop activated, and the gold curves slowly began to turn clockwise. It gradually began to spin, gaining speed until it was eventually nothing more than a blur on his desk. Then, a faint blue plasmatic light began to form in the center. The sleeping boy lay nearby, completely unaware, and sprawled out in his bed. Elsewhere in the room, the fly that had been so bothersome now sat atop a long-forgotten plastic cup, using its forelegs to wash the hundreds of lenses that comprised its compound eyes. The shimmering blue light immediately caught its attention, and it cocked its head a moment before deciding to investigate. It flew in a sloppy line before alighting on the desk, where it walked in short, zigzagged bursts until it came close to the spinning loop. When it was just a few inches away, a blue tendril suddenly appeared from the center of the blur, where it wavered like a candle flame. Then, without warning, it suddenly shot outward toward the fly, like a praying mantis making a kill. Instead of being eaten, however, the fly completely vanished.
Testin?
Scott's eyes were closed, and the voice drifted to him through a fog of sleep. He was lying on the top covers of his bed, still in his clothes from the night before, and his conscious and subconscious immediately began a debate as to whether the voice had been real or merely a dream.
Testin,
the voice said again, louder and more clearly this time. It was male, low and projecting, though muffled as though it were coming through a hole in a wall. It continued.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Scott was certain he'd heard it that time, and it startled him awake. Oh, God! It was just as he'd feared. Walter had gone nuts, and when Scott opened his eyes, he would find the old man standing over him, the Nazi dagger raised high overhead. Scott's eyes flew open, but to his relief, the room was just as empty as it had been before. Only something wasn't quite right. It was the wrong color. Instead of the pale tan to which he was accustomed, the walls and ceiling were bathed in a hue of bright blue. At first, he thought it was just the ambient light of the computer monitors, having left them on to run the program. But this was different, much brighter. And what was that noise? Something was humming loudly, sounding like a hummingbird on steroids. He raised his head and looked around, trying to pinpoint the source, and was shocked to find both the light and noise were coming from his desk. It was the gold loop. Only it wasn't a loop anymore. It was a blurry orb, and it took Scott a moment to figure out it was because the thing was spinning so rapidly. What the hell? Scott eased from his bed for a closer look, careful not to get too close. Suspended in the middle of the furiously whirling loop was a small ball of blue energy about the size of a dime. It reminded him of the plasma balls sold at novelty stores, only this one had no glass to contain it. He almost started to reach out and touch it, but quickly stopped himself, deciding that would probably be a very bad idea. Aside from the fact the gold loop was spinning so fast it could probably take a finger off, he had no idea what the thing was or what it was actually doing. He was suddenly concerned it might be bathing him in some kind of radiation, and this time tomorrow he would find himself bald, sterile, and growing a third arm. He took a step back to consider things a moment. On the one hand, he had woken up, so apparently the thing wasn't lethal. He wasn't vomiting, and his hair wasn't falling out, both very good signs. On the other hand, there was no way of knowing it wasn't causing a tumor or cancer or something as equally nasty that would kill him on down the road. He was still debating when the voice startled him again.
Testen, testen. 1, 2, 3, 4. The end.
Scott, now panicked, looked around the room to see who the hell had just spoken. He was still quite alone, however, and gradually began to realize, with no small amount of terror, just where the voice had come from. He looked back, wide-eyed, at the shimmering loop and the blue plasma for a long moment before he managed to say anything. "Hello?" he said tentatively. The loop hummed as it whirled, but made no other sound. He listened closely, and thought he heard what sounded like a few people murmuring to each other, only he couldn't understand what they were saying because it was too soft and distant, and it definitely wasn't English. He heard another voice say something that sounded like Mer Strom, but he, of course, had no idea what that meant. Suddenly, the blue light began to grow in intensity, making Scott stumble back. He tripped over a pile of junk and fell backwards. Lying on the floor, he looked up in horror as the blue ball of light slowly began to grow. First, the size of a nickel, then a quarter, then finally a $50. The light became brighter and more intense, harder to look at. He noticed a pungent odor in the air that he recognized as being ozone, a gas formed when electricity interacts with the atmosphere and generates O3. He began to panic, not knowing what the heck was happening or just how big this thing was going to get. The plasma ball continued to grow, as did the smell, and he started to hear popping sounds coming from inside his computer. He thought once about making a run for the fire extinguisher in the kitchen, but decided the better move would be to just shut the thing down. The power button was on the other side of the computer, however, and there was no way he was getting close to that thing. Instead, he decided to yank the plug. He quickly crawled on all fours to the wall, carefully watching over his shoulder at the terrifying sight on his desk. The blue plasma ball was now almost as big as the loop itself, and sparks and smoke began to pour out of his computer tower. He grabbed the plug, only to abruptly let it go again. It was far hotter than it should have been, and nearly burned his hand. Above him, the blue plasma ball continued to grow until it expanded outside the rim of the whirling loop. Scott was about to run away to dial 911 when there was suddenly a loud pop, and the plasma ball abruptly shrank and disappeared, leaving the room in complete darkness. Scott didn't dare move. He sat in the dark, crouched beneath the desk, breathing heavily. All was quiet, save for the sound of the loop spinning above, the humming lowering in pitch as the revolutions began to slow. When it finally came to a stop, the room was completely still. Scott looked around and noticed that nothing electrical appeared to be functioning. No hum of his mini-fridge, no blinking red LED light on the computer surge protector. All were dead, and it eventually dawned on him that the loop must have tripped a breaker on the main electrical box. He breathed a sigh of relief, then had to let out a nervous laugh, wondering what the hell just happened.